lucky to be joined today by Dr. Robert Greenberg, who is the former CEO of Second Sight Medical and now is the chairman of the Alfred Mann Foundation. So let's give Bob a nice warm welcome. So it's been about 5 years since we last had you up on this stage, and a lot has changed for you since then, since the Argus device was approved. So can you sort of bring us up to date on where Argus is now and what Second Sight is doing with the Orion?
Yeah, so maybe a little bit of background about Second Sight. So Second Sight was a company that I founded with Alfred Mann about 20 years ago. And the company's vision was literally to restore vision to blind patients through electrical stimulation. It's very similar in concept to another company that Al Mann had started, Advanced Bionics, that was doing the same thing for cochlear implants. So the cochlear implants were electrical stimulators that restored hearing to deaf people. And we had this idea. I had done a little bit of work in graduate school at Johns Hopkins looking at trying to electrically stimulate the retina of blind patients to see if we could restore vision just in the same way the cochlear implants did. So when we launched Second Sight, it was a spin-off from the Alfred Mann Foundation that we'll talk more about in a bit. But we originally took a cochlear implant that we modified and ran an electrode to the eye to kind of test the concept to see if could we actually do this chronically, and it worked. That was what we called the Argus One. And so we developed a more sophisticated device. That Argus One took 8 hours to implant, took 4 surgeons. It was a pretty heroic effort. We only implanted 6 patients right here in Los Angeles at USC. And all 6 were able to see something. These were previously totally blind patients. So we kind of knew we were on the right track. And so we developed a 60 electrode stimulator, which was the Argus 2. And that was the product that we actually took to market. That was the one that the reason I was here 5 years ago was we had just gotten FDA approval for that product, and so since getting FDA approval, we ended up launching that product both in the U.S. and internationally. We were able to get Medicare reimbursement for it. The current reimbursement is around $155,000, so it's been around $150,000 for the implant. So we're very fortunate to be able to get Medicare highly valued the device, and I think it goes to kind of how all of us intuitively highly value our vision. And so it was a relatively easy sell, actually. And internationally, that's been true as well. So the product's available now in Asia and in Europe. So then in 2014, we actually took the company public on NASDAQ and began work on a new implant, a direct brain interface. So this was a modification, similar idea that instead of stimulating the retina of blind patients, we could directly interface to the visual part of the brain. And the advantage of that was primarily that the Argus, the retinal stimulator, could only benefit people that had an intact optic nerve. So the cable going from the eye to the brain had to be intact for the Argus to work. And unfortunately, most blind patients have damaged optic nerves, so they can't really benefit from the Argus. There's a limited subset of blind patients that can benefit from the Argus. It's life-changing for those patients, and we've implanted over 300 of those patients, but it was a small subset of the totally blind patients. So by going directly to the brain, we could potentially benefit all blind patients. And so we've now, just recently, just this year, implanted 5 patients so far with the Orion stimulator, the direct brain stimulator, and that's going well. So we've got just like with the Argus, all 5 patients of these initial devices are able to see something with the device, and we're working on refining that right now.
So you've got the Orion trial underway.
Yep.
You moved to the Alfred Mann Foundation, which was formed after Al launched Pacesetter, which now is St. Jude Medical and now Abbott. Tell us about how a tennis match led to the founding of Pacesetter.
Yeah, I returned back to the foundation, which is actually where I started with Al Mann, and this was a medical device incubator. Going back a little bit further about kind of how Al got into the medical device business. So Al Mann was in the 1950s was working in the aerospace business actually here in LA, and he had a company, Heliotech, making solar cells for satellites. And he had a friend that he met at Johns Hopkins who had developed Bob Fischel had developed a rechargeable pacemaker. And he was playing tennis with Bob, and Bob said, you ought to think about working on medical things. Aerospace is nice, but so much more impactful to people if you did something medical. And I've got this rechargeable pacemaker. Why don't you help me develop it into a company and commercialize it? And Al thought about it and said okay. And that was kind of how Pacesetter got launched. And it was about 1969. It was launched on this idea of a rechargeable pacemaker. And it's kind of an interesting story in itself because pacemakers at the time were and even today are disposable batteries. And so the thought that Bob Fischel had was, well, why would you want to implant somebody with a disposable battery that you would have to reopen them up and put a new battery in after, at the time, they only lasted about a year? Much better to have a rechargeable device that would last forever. Well, it turned out Medtronic had the non-rechargeable version. They were the market leader at the time. They were kind of predated Pacesetter by a few years. And Medtronic came after them pretty hard with these rechargeable pacemakers. They convinced the surgeons that you're not going to get reimplantation fees. You're not going to get to do another surgery. And they convinced the patients that if you forget to recharge, you'll die. So that unfortunately I think for patients and for anyone who has a pacemaker today, the Pacesetter was forced in order to compete to shift to non-rechargeable and actually dropped the rechargeable pacemakers.
So, in addition to, of course, Second Sight, the foundation went on to spin out kind of an amazing array of companies across a really wide variety of conditions or indications. Advanced Bionics, which you mentioned, that had the cochlear implant, which is now the sort of the core of the neuromodulation unit at Boston Scientific. MiniMed, now part of Medtronic's diabetes business. Just last month, Axonics Modulation Technologies raised a $138 million IPO. Why did these companies prove so successful across such a wide range of conditions?
So the foundation, as you mentioned, was founded by Al with the revenue from when when Pacesetter was sold to Siemens, was the first one to buy Pacesetter. It's now part of Abbott. It was later sold to St. Jude. Is now Abbott's cardiac rhythm management division. But when it was sold, the foundation was really started at that point with some of the people that had started Pacesetter with Al. As you mentioned, there have been a number of these companies that have done extraordinarily well compared to others that have tried to do similar things in the field. And I think there were a few things that were different about the products that were developed at the Al Mann Foundation. I think one of them was that there was a common infrastructure that all of these had. So it was essentially an incubator before the term incubator even existed. It really, this infrastructure of laboratory space and technical talent and equipment and expertise in regulatory and quality and in the manufacturing of these devices, that core expertise ended up being leveraged each time a new company was developed. So a lot of that built up knowledge over a period of what ended up being, I guess today it's over 40 years, has really benefited each new startup. And I know certainly Second Sight, when I started Second Sight with Al from the foundation, we, for the first 4 years, were actually co-located with the foundation and used a lot of the infrastructure and resources of the foundation to launch the company and to begin the company. I mean, even we had common HR at the time. So it allowed these companies to be a lot more capital efficient and it allowed them to make fewer mistakes. I think, you kind of like to think that as time went on, you made fewer and fewer mistakes, or at least made different mistakes. I think every time seems to be a new learning experience, something new. But
He also had patience and sort of the long view that these things take a long time, and it's worth the investment and the time it takes to do that.
Yeah, I think the focus of the foundation has always been on the patient. I think that's also been another key, and as you said, the patients to stick with these projects for a long time, and obviously access to the capital to be able to do that. All of those were really important.
So show us a little bit about what the foundation is working on now.
Sure. So we have a little bit of a slide of what we're doing today. Skip through a few of these. So this is one of the projects. I mean, you mentioned the most recent spin out from the foundation was Exonics. It's the one, the company that just went public a few weeks ago. That you mentioned. That product is a neurostimulator, and a lot of these products have been neurostimulators. They've been things that are implantable in the body. Has really been the core expertise of the foundation. I think the foundation does better than probably anybody else in the world. And so Exonics has developed and is just finishing a clinical trial for urinary incontinence for overactive bladder. And that product they've just applied within the last week or so for FDA approval for that product. So newly public company. This IME is the one I'll tell you a little bit about. Is one of our internal projects that will probably sometime next year transfer this to a corporation in the field. And this was a project for patients who were amputees, so people that have lost limbs. The idea was we could injectively implant sensors, muscle EMG sensors or muscle sensors, to actually pick up the signals from the residual limb to control an artificial limb, to control a robotic hand or a robotic leg. And so here you can see in this on the left is where you would inject or implant multiple sensors, and then with it'll control an artificial hand naturally, kind of like the way you would normally would with a real hand. And this is the implant. And these are incredibly sophisticated implants. A million transistor ASIC on the inside, coils that are hermetically sealed, remotely powered by the RF power, so there's no implantable battery in this particular device. There's not a lot of room. You can see how small this device is. It's by far the smallest neural sensing implant that's been used in patients. And then this is a short video that kind of describes it in a little bit more detail.
In order to move our hands, electrochemical signals travel from the brain through the nerves to the muscles, which contract and create the intended movement. The Alfred Mann Foundation has developed the implantable myoelectric sensor, known as the AEMF system. It is a minimally invasive, intuitive control system for prosthetics that takes advantage of the electrochemical signals that exist in the body. Wireless AEMF sensors are implanted into the residual limb of an amputee, where they detect the signals going to the muscles that control specific movements. These signals are captured and sent wirelessly from the implanted sensor to a decoder box, which serves as an electronic brain. Here, the signals in the nerves and muscles are translated into the intended movement in the artificial limb. Essentially, the AEMF system bridges the brain and the artificial limb, enabling the brain to intuitively control the prosthesis. In AEMF's ongoing trial at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center with affected veterans, the FDA has approved the operation of 3 simultaneous degrees of freedom: opening and closing the hand, rotating the wrist 360 degrees, and lateral movement of the thumb. Combining these 3 movements enables several grasps that are invaluable for performing everyday tasks.
That was a description, and so this is actually one of the soldiers that was implanted at Walter Reed, who has an artificial limb. And here you can, if we play this video, you can see him actually using the device in comparison to his natural hand. And that's all just by thinking it, by the same as he would do with his natural hand.
That's cool.
So this is one example of the kind of projects that we do at the foundation. We try to mix up the projects with, in every one of them has to have a high unmet medical need, but we try to mix them up with sizes of market, with difficulties in challenging the project, so that this is one that has a relatively small indication, relatively few people are amputees, but super high impact and medical need. And so, and we have other ones that are larger markets. But
so when you're considering starting a potential project, how do you go about identifying that poorly met need or the unmet need that's suitable?
Yeah, I think it's one of the hardest things, and we often get academic physicians coming to us with ideas, and our team will attend conferences and bring back ideas that way. But winnowing them down to the ones that are going to have the highest impact, I think, is one of the biggest challenges. And it is a trade-off, and we have a senior management team and a board that reviews every aspect about the project. It's a lot of the same process that you would use in starting a company or getting a company funded, venture funded. We look at IP, we look at both what patents we might have or might be able to license, as well as freedom to operate. We'll look at market size, we'll look at reimbursement, we'll look at team, our ability to access folks with expertise in the area. So kind of all the factors that you would look at for a startup.
So since you've taken over, you're sort of turning your eye outward and looking at local companies in the ecosystem. Are you using the same kind of rubric to select those companies to work with?
We are. So one of the things that we're doing a little differently now at the foundation is, in addition to sourcing our own projects and developing our own internal projects that we spin out into companies, we're also incubating other local companies and providing this infrastructure. One of the realizations that I had about a year ago was that this infrastructure can be super helpful to startups that might only have a half a dozen people. And in the same way that it was helpful to our own startup ideas, it could be helpful to other startups. And so we've started working with local companies, providing them access to the labs, to the personnel, and to the infrastructure in general. And then as far as picking those companies, our criteria are similar to picking our own internal projects, but we're also looking for companies that are past that initial fundraise at this point. So today we're not actively providing seed capital to those companies, although it's something that we're looking at. In the next phase of this, we're looking at standing up a separate fund that would provide seed capital to some of these incubated companies as well.
And feed them through the foundation.
Correct.
So can you tell us about some of the companies you're working with now?
Yeah, so just one local example here in Orange County is a company, Vivicor, that, I have a slide on their work, and they're developing, this is the axonic stimulator, they're developing a totally artificial heart. So this is a project that, again, it's an implantable product, so it fits well with our core expertise at the foundation, which is another factor. We want to make sure that we're going to provide enough leverage and benefit to the startup. And so they have a novel approach to this. Other people have tried to do this and failed in the past. And if we can play this video, what's unique about Vivicor's approach is they have a maglev impeller that you'll see in a second that divides the two circulations, the left and right side of the heart. And it's a pretty clever design because it's magnetically levitated through a control logic. They can actually slide. Here you can see if they turn on this magnet, they can slide the impeller one direction. If they turn on the other magnet, they can slide it back and forth and control the relative pressure of left and right. So they can sort of dynamically adapt. The design of this impeller also is less destructive to red blood cells, which is another problem that other artificial hearts have suffered from in the past. So they're currently in animal trials, and we're working with them to qualify this device for first-in-man studies.
Well, so it seems like this might be even a silly question after we've seen all of these amazing breakthroughs, but speaking more generally, what do you see as the more exciting frontiers in medical devices, in medtech?
Yeah, I think it's medtech. I mean, I'm a little bit biased, but I think medtech is one of the most exciting areas that you can go into in engineering in general. I think the things that we're looking at today, we're looking a lot more that we never had looked at previously. Is we're looking a lot more at digital health solutions. We're looking at how artificial intelligence and data can play a role in medical devices. It's something that historically we had a lot of implants that were generating data, but we weren't necessarily using that data. So we're spending a lot more time now looking at, particularly for our implants, we're thinking a lot more about the data that's being generated by those and how that can be leveraged for the benefit of patients ultimately.
Do we have any questions for Bob while we've got him? Oh, come on, the guy's going to cure blindness. You don't want to ask him something?
Secret sauce.
I'm curious, I mean, you have all these great ideas probably coming to you, and how you get from everything that you've seen and to examples you just showed us. How do you go through the clinical and technology validation process to decide? I mean, all of us have seen so many great ideas come and go that just don't get to the point anywhere near what you just showed us with the mind control example.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So why do so many great ideas die on the vine? And I think the foundation was really Al Mann's vision of how to address that problem. And I think there are a few reasons why ideas don't make it ultimately to patients. I think one of the challenges is an idea is just an idea. It takes a tremendous amount of effort and execution to actually get it to the point where it can even be tested in a patient. And it takes a lot of infrastructure. And I think one of the challenges for academic researchers in particular is there's not an incentive mechanism for an academic researcher to develop this infrastructure to be able to build a device and have it done under a quality system and have it go through the FDA regulatory process to be able to even test it in a patient. And so I think the foundation, one of the things that we're trying to do with the foundation is to provide that infrastructure to be able to take devices take ideas at least to that stage, at least to the point where you can test them in a patient. And then that is a value inflection point for the foundation. It helps us keep the model sustainable, but it's also the point that we found that it's easier to raise capital for a company around the idea once it's been proven in humans. I think there are a lot of ideas that in the past have been tested in animals and didn't pan out in patients, and so a lot of investors are reluctant to invest in an idea that's at the animal stage or the concept stage, knowing that there's very high likelihood of fallout as you kind of progress through those early stages. So that's sort of one value death. And then the FDA approval to actually get it on the market is really another one that I think scares a lot of investors, particularly that aren't in the medical device field. The FDA regulatory risk is getting better. It's getting more predictable, but in the past, it's been a wild card that's hurt a lot of small companies. And so those kind of two milestones are things that we try to help companies and our startups in particular get through those stages. And part of it is the experience of our group and also just the patience of our group, knowing that sometimes it takes longer than you plan. In fact, it almost always takes longer than you plan. Pretty universal truth.
I was wondering if you have looked at any devices for the pediatric space, because that's always been such a huge challenge. The FDA has guidelines, and the government, tries to put out, money available. What's your experience and what's your take on that? Because it's obviously a lot of risk, and I've been in big companies, and they don't really want to take it on. So I was wondering if, I was just thought, well, maybe your organization has looked at that as an opportunity, especially because you've looked at people that are a fairly small patient population, and any comment on that?
No, it's a great question. The government has done some things to try to encourage companies to pursue the pediatric indication. In fact, the humanitarian device exemption pathway at the FDA was one that we used at Second Sight to get the Argus approved in adults. But one aspect of that regulation is that you were exempted, and we actually helped lobby to get this law changed. But the way the law was set up is you weren't allowed to get a profit if you weren't allowed to make a profit if you were an HD approved device unless it was for a pediatric indication. And so pediatric indications were allowed to get profits if you were an HD. Now it's been expanded, so actually all HDs can make a profit. We argued successfully to Congress that that was kind of an un-American concept. Like, if you're going to really try to encourage companies to go after these humanitarian indications, why wouldn't you allow them to make a profit? It's going to be hard for them to make a profit anyway, but why would you forbid it? And so they actually opened that up. But as far as projects that we've gone after for pediatrics, there have been relatively few for the reasons that you stated. It's hard, it's high risk, but the one that we've worked on in the past has been delivery of insulin, insulin pumps for juvenile diabetes. But the other ones we haven't. I don't know that we haven't gotten a lot of people bringing those ideas to us either, for whatever reason. I think it's one of those things. One of the nice things about the Argus was that we were working in a blind eye, so we couldn't possibly hurt the patient. They were going to be blind. They were starting blind, and even if in the worst case they were going to remain blind. I think with kids, there's a reluctance even amongst some of our physicians of doing aggressive interventions because if it's the old Hippocratic oath, do no harm. In children, the risk of doing harm is much higher. They have their whole lives ahead of them. So, when I look at like a Vivicor, it's a similar kind of situation where these patients are gonna need a heart. They're gonna die anyway. They have no alternative. So if you can provide something that's gonna give them additional years of life, it's quote all upside. And so we haven't necessarily shied away from pediatrics, but we haven't had a lot of people bring them to us, I think, because of those reasons.
Any other questions for Bob?
It's an important area, though. I think there's a lot of opportunity in that space.
Okay.
Back.
Great.
Somebody in the back.
Oh. I'm sorry, I missed you.
Thank you. Very quick question, because you have a view on so many innovations happening around the world. Do you see a geographical switch from where these innovations are coming from more and more?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question too. So historically, a lot of the innovations were coming from the U.S. and the capital was available for these early stage ideas and companies in the U.S. We're actually seeing a lot of that move, particularly in the early stage, to Europe over the last few years. We're seeing in France and in Germany some of the more of an appetite for funding some of the earlier stage projects, which is a little bit surprising. I think there's still a lot of ideas, a lot of the digital health on the device side. A lot of the digital health programs are still getting funded here in the U.S. And a lot of the AI, things that are sort of trendy are still getting funded here. And Axonics just was able to do a $138 million IPO. So later stage projects are getting funded, but the earlier stage projects, I would say we're seeing right now, anyway, a little bit more interest in Europe. That depends on the stage.
Last chance.
Also in China, we're seeing a lot of investment for early stage medtech coming out of China as well.
Got one right here.
Yeah, so this was the most recent spin out from the foundation, and this is the one I mentioned that was treating overactive bladder. And so here you can see the product is an implant that stimulates the sacral nerve. There's an external device that communicates to the implant. It's a rechargeable device. So this one, so here we've gone full circle. This is the rechargeable technology is now actually coming back in vogue in some cases. Although interestingly, Axonics also, much to my chagrin, is beginning development of a non-rechargeable version also that some people are asking for. So anyway, in a patient programmer, so that the physicians can program the device as well, and the patients can turn the device on and off as well as a patient controller. This one is pretty slick industrial design, which is something else that we're seeing as pretty important for a lot of our startups, both from a patient usability standpoint and acceptance of the technology, as well as for getting investment. We've found that the companies that have put the investment in the usability and aesthetics of the device actually pays off more than I think I would have thought if you asked me that same question 20 years ago. These are just, I think this is a somewhat interesting slide. So this is some of the stages that all of these projects go through during the development, starting from, I can see it over here, starting with the idea, going to the R&D and testing and clinical trials and ultimately commercialization. And this slide's making the point that we tend to focus on everything up until the actual launch and commercialization. We will build products at the foundation for patient trials, but not commercial volumes of product, and we won't hire the sales and marketing team. We think that's better done at a separate, dedicated company or as part of a larger manufacturer. And exits can happen and have happened all the way along the continuum. I think we like to take projects a little bit further down the path if we can. I think the other point maybe I'll make is that I think one of the things that really differentiates the foundation over other either incubators or tech development, medtech development organizations is really I think of it as a research engine with a commercialization focus. So different than an academic research focus, our focus is entirely getting these products to patients and forming companies. Al Mann had this belief that, which we all share, that unless the products actually make it to a company, they won't benefit patients. You won't have the distribution infrastructure. So although our ultimate goal is to help individuals and patients with these various diseases, we feel really strongly that these products ultimately need to find a home in a company so that they can be distributed for the benefit of patients.
Well, I think that's it.
Great. How about a round of applause for Bob?